We're so close to finishing our Vue 3 powered forum and deploying it for the world to see. Before we do though, we've got a few screws to tighten up and bugs to fix. Let's start by addressing the warning that Firebase has been showing us in the console ever since we installed it. It says, "It looks like you're using the development build of the Firebase JS SDK. When deploying Firebase apps to production, it is advisable to only import the individual SDK components you intend to use." Now that we've solidified what all Firebase services we're going to need, we can include the code only for those services to make our final bundle lighter. Alright, let's create a new file called Firebase in the helpers directory. In here, we'll import Firebase from firebase/app, just like the warning instructed. Then, we'll import each of the individual Firebase services that we use. That is Auth, Firestore, and Storage. We'll also export Firebase by default. Lastly, we just need to replace all the times that we import Firebase directly from the npm package with an import of this file. I'll pull up my project-wide find and replace in VS Code by pressing Command-Shift-H. Now, I want to find all the instances of import Firebase from Firebase and replace all those instances with import Firebase from @/helpers/Firebase. Awesome. Now, back in the browser, we can see that the warning is gone. And clicking around a little bit, everything looks like it's still working. Great. Next up, let's clean up the thread's replies count. Right now, if we create a brand new thread, you'll notice that the replies count doesn't really make sense. It says 0 replies by 1 contributor. That's because in the original seed data, we weren't adding the thread author as a contributor, unless they'd actually replied to their own thread, which makes sense. But since we've started creating new threads via the application interface, we've been adding the thread author as a contributor on thread create. Let's fix that now. When we dispatch the create post action from the create thread action, let's add a property to the post called first in thread. Then, over in the create post action, let's check to see if first in thread has been set on the post. Otherwise, we'll default it to false. Then, we'll extract the thread updates to its own variable. And then, only if the post is not the first in the thread, append the auth ID as the contributor. Also, we'll only commit the append contributor to the thread mutation if the post is not the first in the thread. Now, this means that sometimes the contributors property on threads won't be set. So let's amend the contributors count on the thread getter to return early with 0 if contributors doesn't exist. If we check back in the browser now, the thread we just created just a minute ago is still inaccurate because it still has the stale invalid data. But If we create a brand new thread, everything looks good. I'll also open up this incognito window where I'm logged in as a different user and reply to the thread we just created. Great, this also works. Finally, if you're up to the challenge, I bet you can make the replies and the contributors' nouns here the singular when there's only one of them. The solution will be in the source code of this lesson. In this video, let's finish cleaning some things up. If I go to the miscellaneous form that has no threads, we get an error in the console and a spinner that just keeps on spinning and spinning. Let's follow the error messages to fix our issue. This error is in the Fetch Items action. The issue here is that IDs is undefined instead of an array. Let's default IDs to an empty array if it's faulty. Alright, that took care of that error. The next error is cannot read properties of undefined, and it's in forum.view. So, the issue here is that threads isn't an array, and thus doesn't have a length property. Let's use optional chaining here in order to prevent this from throwing an error. And then we'll default thread count to 0 if it resolves to a faulty value. Great, the page displays and the errors are gone. We do still have this warning though. That's some leftover pagination thing that never actually got used, so let's just remove that. Alright, now our console is clean and the page is loading, but the list isn't very pretty. Let's provide a message for the threads list when it's empty. Something like, no threads available. In threadslist.view, I'll wrap the list of threads with a div with a vif on it that checks if there are any threads. Then, outside of the div with the class of threadList, I'll provide the message when there are no threads. I chose to put it outside the threadlist div instead of using the v-else inside that div, just for styling purposes, so don't overthink that. It's really nothing fancy. Lastly, I'll throw in a couple inline styles here, just to make things look a little nicer. Alright, that's looking great. Let's tackle one more bug in this lesson. I've reseeded the database and created a number of posts, numbering them 1 to 10. If I visit my profile page directly, you can see that these show up in descending order. And this is correct, as this is the reverse order that I made them in. But now if I navigate to the thread that some of those posts were made on, my posts show first, even though Rolf actually started this thread, and his post and Blossom's post should be first. Not only that, but if I refresh this page, and you can see what it's supposed to look like, but then I visit my profile page, you'll see the order here is now messed up. Let's fix this by clearing out the existing post items in the store between pages. To do this, I'll first create a mutation in mutation.js called clear items. I'll make it so that the clear items can take in an array of any of the Vuex modules that we want to clear the items for. Lastly, I'll loop over the modules and reset the items in each. Next, over in actions.js, I'll create an action with the same name and payload, and just commit the mutation. This might seem a little unnecessary, but I want to keep up the practice of only calling mutations from within the store and using actions in other parts of our codebase. Now, we can add an after each route guard where we can dispatch our new action. That is, we can clear out things right after the route changes, but before the page components are created. And I'll just go ahead and clear out everything but the users between routes. I chose to leave out users here because I don't want to clear out our authenticated user, and there isn't anywhere in our application where a list of users exists that should be in any particular order. So this was just easiest. Alright, now over in the browser, if I refresh the profile page, it all looks good. When I visit the thread I visited before, my posts are now ordered as they should be. I'll refresh this thread and then visit my profile page like we did earlier. And yeah, it's in the right order now. Great. Since we're loading the data for each page in the created hook of that page, there's no good reason to keep any of the store items around between pages, and clearing them out helps our order act more as expected. Alright, just a little more cleanup to go. You might have noticed that when we save the user's profile information, after we're redirected to the user profile page, the thread count is off. That's because we've confused things a bit between the user getter and the user in the store items. Active user here is the Vuex user getter. And in the update user action, we're passing this computed user in to set item, which sets the item in our state. This matters because on our getter, the threads property is a getter that returns the actual thread objects from the state. However, on our user in the store, the threads property is an array of thread IDs. Alright, let's make sure that the thread IDs are available on the Vuex user getter. I'll just reuse this getter as it already does exactly what we want, but I just want to rename it so that it's a little bit more clear as to what it is. And then, when we dispatch the update user action in the user profile editor card, we can set the threads to the thread IDs before passing it into the action. I'll update the user profile once more, and yeah, that's better. Since we're almost ready to publish to production, let's also remove all our console logs that helped us during development. I'll use Command-Shift-F to search throughout the whole project for any console logs. The first ones in the list are actually in the Firestore import.js file, and I want to leave those there, as this file is a command line tool for us, and those console logs give us valuable feedback when we run the command. The next is in signin.view. This one isn't needed, so I'll remove it. You get the idea. There's nothing difficult about this, so I'll do the same thing for all the other console logs off camera, and you can do the same if you'd like. Now, with all the console logs removed, there's less noise in the console. Let's click through the application and look out for some errors. Homepage looks good, and the forum looks good. On the thread pages, we do have this warning, missing required prop label. This is from our app form field, and we're not providing the label for the post. Let's just give it a default of an empty string and not make it required. Nice, the warning's gone. I'll also submit a post. Great, still no errors. And how about we create a thread? Awesome, no errors there either. And edit it. Still no errors. And let's see. I think that about does it. We aren't getting any errors in the console. Lastly, in this lesson, there are a couple of features on the user profile page that we aren't going to actually implement. Let's go ahead and remove this link here to see only started threads. That's over in profile.view. Cool. Let's also remove this member since and last visited stuff down here. That's in user profile card.view. And we'll remove the horizontal rule just below it too, since it only makes sense with the text above it. Awesome. Right now, if we were to update our email address on the profile edit page, then it would only update in the Firestore, but not in the actual authentication service. This means if we were to sign out and try to sign in with the new email address, it won't work. Instead, we still have to use the old email address. Let's fix that. I'll create an action in the AuthViewX module called Update Email. And it will take an email address in the payload. In here, I'll target the current user in the Firebase Auth service and call the update email method. Now, we just need to dispatch this action in the user profile card editor's save method. I'll also add a wait to the line above, so we ensure that we're finished updating the user before we update the email. Now, when we change the email and log out, we can now log in with the new email. Great. Unfortunately, we still have a problem though. If we were to wait about 5 minutes or so and try to do this again, we'd get an error in the console from Firebase saying something like, "User must re-authenticate to update email." You may have even gotten that message already if you hadn't recently logged in and just tried what we tried together. That's because, in order to change critical information like the email or the password, Firebase works extra hard to ensure that you really are you, and thus wants you to provide your email and password once more. So, Let's make it so that when the user is updating everything but the email, things continue to work as they have been. But if they change the email address, a modal overlay pops up, prompting them to provide their credentials. Then, only after providing the correct credentials do we update the user profile data and the email address. Alright, to do this, let's first create a new component called User Profile Card Editor Reauthenticate. In this file, we'll provide the form to gather the user's username and password. I'll start by providing data props to store the entered username and password. Then, I'll provide the markup for the form. We can use the V form here, as well as our handy app form fields. Now, on submit of the form, we want to reauthenticate the user. And I'll create the method. In this method, we'll call an action on our auth vuex module that we'll create in just a minute, passing in the email and password from the form. We'll also use a try catch here to emit some events from our component. That way, when we use the component inside of the user profile card editor, it can respond based on a good or bad authentication. Alright, now let's go create that action. It will need to take in an email and password. Then, we need to get what's called the credential. We can do that by calling firebase.auth.emailauthprovider.credential and passing it the email and password. Then, we can use that credential to reauthenticate the current user. Great. Next, we need to get our form showing up in the modal overlay. In order to bootstrap this quickly, I'll install Vue Final Modal version 3. Then, I'll import and register the Vue Final Modal component into our Reauthenticate component. And I've chosen just to do this locally here, as we'll only need it this once. Now, we should wrap our form with the modal. I'll also add some props to Vue Final Modal for styling purposes. Classes will equal modal-container, and content-class will equal modal. And I'll wrap our form in a div with the class of modal content. All this is necessary because Vue Final Modal is what's known as a renderless component. That is, it leaves the styling up to us, so I'm just utilizing some classes that are already defined in the main style sheet. Finally, I'll add a header to our modal so that the user gets a little bit more context. Alright, to show and hide the modal, we can use vModal on our ViewFinal modal. Now, show modal that I've made up here could be a data property, but I'm going to make it into a computer property. The reason is so that we can have our component support a vModal for opening and closing the modal overlay. On the get of the computed prompt, we want to return a prop called model value. And on set, we want to emit the event update model value. Lastly, we'll need to accept model value as a prop to our component. This will allow us now to use our component like this. Supporting vModel on our custom components in this manner is a fairly common pattern. Let's also throw some handlers on there for our other two events. Alright, let's continue this in the next lesson. Now, we have our new reauthenticate component ready to work with. So, let's define the needs reauth. It will need to be a boolean indicating whether the email has changed, and thus we need to reauthenticate. Then, in the save method, we can check if the email address has changed. We can do that by comparing the email address on the active user with the email address on the user from the prop. And if email has changed, then change needs reauth to true. Otherwise, do the normal update and route change. I'll also remove the update email here, and we'll do that instead after our user has reauthenticated by defining the onReauthenticated method that is our handler for the success event of the reauthenticate component. Let's also extract our logic for saving the user profile data into its own function. That way, we can call it in both save and after we reauthenticate. Great. Now all we need to do is handle a reauthentication failure. Let's define the onReauthenticated failed method, which we've called on the fail event of the reauthenticate component. In here, we'll just notify the user of the error. And redirect back to the profile page. Lastly, to make the add notification function available here, we need to import the composable. Then, use the composable in the setup function to access Add Notification. And finally, expose Add Notification to the rest of the component. While we're at it, let's go ahead and add a notification on a successful update as well. Alright, I think that should do it. Let's go and check things out in the browser. Oh man, we broke everything. Let's check out what's going on in the console. Message was accessed during render but is not defined on instance. This one's a little tricky, but I think it's because we didn't return add notification as part of an object, but rather the whole thing. Alright, that should help. Now, we've got a new issue. Failed to resolve directive modal. Ah, it looks like we used vmodal instead of vmodel in the reauthenticate component. Alright, cross your fingers. Nice. Okay, now things are working better. Let's go through the flow. First, I'll update the profile without changing the email address and make sure it works as normal. Cool. Now I'll make an update to the email address and hit save. This time, I'm prompted to log in. So, after I log in with the correct credentials, awesome, it says I'm successful. And if I go to sign out again, and then sign in, I can use the updated email address. And yeah, it logs me in. Perfect. Alright, we haven't implemented the ability to update the current user's password, but it really doesn't look too different from what we've done with the email address. For homework, why don't you try your hand at implementing password updating yourself? And feel free to share your solutions in the comments. It's time to deploy our project to the world. Instead of using Firebase hosting, though, let's use the popular service Netlify. Netlify is a great hosting solution for static sites or SPAs like our forum. In fact, Vue uses Netlify to host the official Vue.js docs. Best of all, it's free to get started and has a generous free tier that you can use indefinitely depending on your needs and the scale of your traffic. If you don't already have a Netlify account, you'll need to create one. Click Get Started for free. If you already have a GitHub account, I'd strongly suggest signing up with GitHub. It'll smooth the process in a minute when we set up continuous integration. Alright, go ahead and pause the video and sign up for your account. I'll meet you back here in a second. Now that you're logged in Netlify, you should be able to see a page that looks something like this. Great. Back in VS Code, in the terminal I'll type npm run build. This will build our SPA into a directory called dist. These are the files that we'll upload to Netlify. Also, you might see a couple of warnings. Don't worry about those for now. They aren't showstoppers, and we'll talk more about those in just a bit. To upload the dist directory, I'll simply locate it in my Mac Finder, and then I'll drag and drop it to Netlify. Just like that, Netlify spins up our site and gives us a URL to visit it at. What do you know? Our site is live and ready for action. I'll click around and see if things are looking okay. And yeah, it seems to be working well. However, if we try to visit a page other than the home page directly, we get a Netlify styled 404 page. That's because our site is an SPA. On the server side, that means there should only be one entry point, the root index.html file. all routing occurs on the client side. Therefore, we need to instruct Netlify to point all the routes to that index.html file. We can do this by creating a file in the public directory called _redirects. This is a special file that Netlify knows how to read. Then we'll provide a rule that essentially says redirect all routes to the index.html file with a status code of 200. The reason we put this in the public directory is because Netlify expects it at the root of our project, and everything in public will automatically be copied over to the dist directory. Alright, let's run the command again. Navigate to the deploys page in the Netlify dashboard, and re-upload our dist directory. Now, when we refresh the page that we visited earlier, instead of a 404, we get a working page with the correct content. Awesome. Now that we're hosting on Netlify, let's set up our application to automatically deploy whenever we push new code to GitHub. If you aren't familiar with version control with Git, feel free to skip this lesson. You can easily continue to upload your project as we've done thus far. For those of you who do use Git, make sure your project has been initiated as a Git repo and you've committed everything we've done thus far. You'll need to create the repo in GitHub as well and push your project codebase to it. Alright, I've got my project pushed to GitHub. Now, in the Netlify dashboard, I'll go to Site Settings, and then Build and Deploy over here on the left-hand side. And then finally, Link Site to Git. It's worth noting here that if you're partial to GitLab or Bitbucket over GitHub, those are an option as well, but we'll just be using GitHub as it's by far the most popular. If you haven't already granted permission for Netlify to act on your behalf with GitHub, then you'll be asked to authorize that now. But I've already done so. So Netlify shows me a list of my repos, and I can choose the one that I want to connect my site to. I'll choose the Vue.js 3 masterclass. And now we'll see that Netlify is smart enough to have some of this pre-filled out for us. We want to deploy the master branch, and our build command is npm run build. It pulled that from our package.json. And then lastly, the dist directory that is correct for our published directory. Alright, let's hit deploy site. We can see now that Netlify has started building our site. Now, Netlify will keep an eye on our repo, and anytime we push changes to the master branch, Netlify will run the build step that we were manually running before and redeploy the site. To see that in action, let's make a change to the H1 on the home page. I'll change the headline to Welcome to the Vue.js 3 Masterclass Forum. Then, after adding our changes, committing them, and pushing them to GitHub, back in Netlify, we can see the build in progress. This will take a minute or so, but when it's done, we can go see the updated site. Awesome! Netlify can actually even do this for PRs or any other branch in your repo, giving you an easy way to preview changes contributed by others before merging to master. In this lesson, let's briefly look at the warnings produced when we ran npm run build. The first says, Asset size limit. The following assets exceed the recommended size limit, 244 kilobytes. This can impact web performance. And the offending file here is chunkvendors.thislittlehash.js. So, whenever we have an issue with bundle sizes, the go-to tool is the Webpack Bundle Analyzer. Let's install it. To do that, I'll type View, Add, Webpack-Bundle-Analyzer. Now, after we run the build command, not only is our site built, but we get this page opened in the browser for us that shows us a breakdown of our JavaScript bundles. It's divided into two main bundles, chunkvendor.js and app.js. The warning specifically mentioned the chunk vendors being 928 kilobytes, and that's exactly what we see here. And then we see how each of the different dependencies contribute to that size, based on their size in the diagram. And unfortunately, Firebase Auth and Firestore are making up for more than half of that size, with 587 kilobytes. Since Firebase is such an integral part of our application, there's really no way to get rid of it. However, we are using Firebase 8, but Firebase 9 came out in the middle of the production of this course, and promises a more tree-shakeable library that can contribute to smaller bundle sizes. So, maybe for your next project, you can make the shift to Firebase 9, which really isn't all that different from Firebase 8 in terms of its syntax and functionality. However, this isn't a critical issue. There are plenty of projects out there running on Firebase 8 just fine. They just aren't quite as fast as they could be if they were using Firebase 9, and we can live with the warnings. Now, other times, the bundle analyzer can lead to some more actionable items. Let's take Lodash for example. Right now, it's at about 12.5 kilobytes. Let's say that we weren't importing Lodash functions individually, but rather importing the whole Lodash library, like this. In thread.show, I'll change import difference from Lodash difference to import underscore from Lodash, and then change out the call to difference to underscore dot difference. Now, when I run npm run build again, you'll see Lodash is quite larger, at almost 76 kilobytes. In a case like this, the solution would be to utilize tree shaking, like we've already been doing. So I'll just revert my import to Lodash difference back to the way it was. This is just one example of how the bundle analyzer could be helpful. Other times, you might be able to replace whole libraries with a couple of homemade helper functions if you're only using a small subset of features that the library provides. For instance, this is the common case with moment.js. Alright, while we might not be able to chisel down our chunk vendors bundle, there is one thing we can do to optimize our app bundle. Right now, in our routes file, we're importing each of the page components at the top of the file using a typical ES6 import. This means that each of these components is bundled into the app bundle and is loaded by the browser whether the user visits all these pages or not. We can fix this by using dynamic imports to only load the page components when their corresponding route is visited. So, instead of passing the actual component to the routes component option, we can provide an anonymous function that calls import and then takes the path to find the component at. Alright, let's do the same for the rest of the routes. I'll change it for the profile edit page, category, forum, thread show, thread create, thread edit, almost done, register, sign in, And lastly, not found. Now, VS Code is letting me know that all those imported pages at the top are no longer in use, so we can delete them. And I forgot to do the same for home, so we'll go ahead and switch that one out too. Now, let's run build again and see what the bundles look like. This time, app.js is roughly half the size at 35 KB, and we've got different bundles for each of the different page components. But we can't tell which bundle is which. They're only identified by this random hash. To make the bundles easier to identify and debug, we can give them names. To do that, we use a Webpack magic comment. That looks like a comment before the import file path. We say Webpack chunk name, followed by a colon, and then the name we'd like to give the chunk in quotes. I'll just give it the same name as the page. Let's do the same for all the pages now. We'll run build once more. And now in the analyzer, we can see exactly what chunks correspond to which page. The largest one here is the profile page, and that kind of makes sense. That's where we did most of the work. And you can also see the thread show page here and so on. Alright, so when we look in the dist directory, indeed, we can see those files. Great, now you can redeploy, or if you're using the Git repo to provide automated deployments, just commit and push your changes. Now that our application is available to the world, let's make sure that sharing our site on social media looks awesome and that it's SEO friendly. To add head tags such as title and meta tags to our pages, we'll use the Vue Use head package. To install it, I'll type npm install at vueuse/head. If we go and take a look at the documents, we can see that Vue Use head provides two different ways of setting head tags. The first is with the composition API in the setup method, and the second is in the template. Let's just put ours in the template because it feels the same as writing these in normal HTML, and it just feels really nice to me. First, we'll import the head component inside of app.vue. The head tags defined in app.vue will be applied to all our pages, and then if we want to override any of them on a particular page, we can. Now, we'll use the head component and add a title tag to our site. I'll make the title Vue.js 3 Masterclass Forum. How about we include a description as well? Name equals description, content equals an awesome Vue.js 3 powered forum. Now in the browser, it looks like we broke something. You may forget to apply app.use head. Oh, that's right. We need to use the package plugin first. In main.js, I'll import create head from the package. And then I'll call it, passing it to form app.use. When we check things out in the browser this time, there's no errors in the console, and we have our title tag. Great. Also, if we inspect the elements and look in the head section, we'll see our description. Great. This will be useful for Google search results and so on. Next, since we'll be using this head component throughout our application, let's create a dedicated global component for it called app_head that will be automatically registered. So first I'll create the file. Then I'll just import the head component from View Use Head. And export it by default. We'll also want to override the name of the head component to app_head. So I'll spread head into an object and then provide the new name. Great. Now we can use app_head everywhere without having to manually import it and register it. Plus, I'm sure you'll find some handy ways to extend app_head in the future. Let's start by changing out head in app.view with app_head. That means we can remove the import and register of head. Now, let's use it on the forum page. This time, we'll provide a title that's dynamic. That is, the forum's name. I've added a question mark here, as sometimes the forum isn't defined, and if I don't, it will cause an error. Now, when we visit a forum page, we get the forum's name for the title tag. Awesome. Also, if I take a look at the meta description again, you can see that even though we didn't define it on the forum page, we're still inheriting it from app.view. Feel free to do likewise on any of the other pages as you see fit. Alright, this paves the way for providing our social meta tags. I'll go back to app.view and paste in the meta tags we'll need. Here, we have a title, a description, and an image for all the social sites, including Twitter, who unfortunately does things a little differently. Then, I'll copy the social title tags and override them with the forum name in forum.view. Now, if we go back to the browser, I'll use this handy Chrome extension called Social Share Preview from Placid to see what sharing a page on the site might look like. I've provided a link in the description below to the extension if you'd like to install it yourself. Cool. We've got a nice image, title, description, etc. This looks good. Alright, at this point, it's very important to note that because we're working with an SPA, all these meta tags are being rendered on the client side. Therefore, even though the Chrome extension is showing us good previews, if we left everything as is, it wouldn't actually work for sharing. So, how can we make sure those meta tags are available server-side for the different social platforms to read? In Netlify, we can turn on an awesome feature called pre-rendering. It's under Site Settings, Build and Deploy, and Pre-rendering. Let's turn that on. What this will do is actually render our page as it would be in the browser on Netlify's server before sending it to the client. And it's smart enough to do this only when a search engine or social bot is making the request. All of our normal users will get the SPA as normal. Alright, let's redeploy our site. I'm using the automated deployment set up through GitHub, but if you didn't do that, you can drag and drop the folder to Netlify. We'll wait just a minute for the site to build. Now, we can use the Twitter card validator to see what sharing our page on Twitter would look like. Perfect. We've got everything as we'd expect. Well, that wraps up the Vue.js 3 masterclass. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as Alex and I have enjoyed teaching it. With the concepts and skills you've learned, you're now able to build your very own real-world Vue.js applications and take your development career to new heights. Remember, we also have a number of other courses here at Vue School to help you advance your development career as well. Don't forget to share what you've learned with us and to share what you've built. And if you have any doubts or concerns or questions, feel free to reach out to the team here at Vue School or reach out on Twitter. And I look forward to seeing you in the next course.